Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. This is the final CX Files of 2021, and what a year it's been. I'm joined on this episode by my co-host, Peter Ryan of Ryan Strategic Advisory in Montreal, Canada. Now, at this time of year, every analyst and journalist is busy writing their summaries of the year and all their predictions for 2022. And we did have an episode last week where we did this review and prediction for the year ahead. Now, Peter and I are going to talk about some of the important themes that we keep hearing about from industry insiders, but we aren't just going to repeat the predictions. On this episode, we're talking about gig CX, ambient CX, hybrid contact centers, and genuine career opportunities for people in BPO. And listen out at the end for a special announcement by Peter. All right, Peter, it's great to have you and me just together on this edition of CX Files. I don't think we've ever done a sort of double header where it's just you and I talking together.
Not as co-hosts. I think I've been interviewed a couple of times prior to joining the CX Files, but it's good to have a meeting of the minds, shall we say, as 2022 kicks off.
Yeah, and this is going out just right before the end of the year. So it's New Year's Eve. We're right at the end of 2021. And I thought that, given that you and I have been participating in a lot of these analyst summaries of the year and predictions for 2022, I thought maybe as co-hosts of this podcast, we should just kick around a few of those ideas. So let me kick off with one that I think I've been hearing quite a lot, and that is the adoption of the hybrid model. Clearly in 2020, we saw all the agents in contact centers going home. It was 100% work from home. You saw, companies like Teleperformance went from a few thousand work from home agents to hundreds of thousands. So, clearly it was a massive shift in the industry. And I think that we haven't seen it shake out yet at the end of 2021. We don't know exactly where we will end up, but clearly it seems that more flexibility is going to be a part of the mix. Certainly there will be some sort of hybrid. I think that, there may be some regulated centers where they force everybody back into the contact center, but clearly for a lot of industries that are not so tightly regulated, I think that we're going to start seeing companies asking the agents, what would you prefer to do?
I think that's very, very apt, and I agree with you. The thing that, to my mind, we have to take into account as analysts and as people who look at the industry for a living and try and guess what the trends are going to be is try and determine the extent to which hybrid has been baked in and the extent to which hybrid is still being thought out. And I think that this is a process where organizations are figuring it out as they're going along. In the first half of this year, all we heard about was that the hybrid model is going to take over. The hybrid model is the future of CX. And then when organizations started to try and implement hybrid, something that I picked up on was the fact that there was very unclear about the extent to which this business model does have a roadmap or does have a blueprint. And I think that it's going to depend heavily on the company's culture, the extent to which you're going to see how many agents are going to be working from home most of the time versus the ones that are in center. Equally speaking, it's going to depend heavily on the industry. Mark, you touch on the regulation with regards to certain spaces, and that's something that's very real. And it might not just be a case of clients wanting the outsourcers to have the agents back in, but they just have to because that's what the law says. And then there's the whole issue about what the agents want, as you say, the extent to which agents decide they'd prefer to work remotely as opposed to working in center. One of the things I'm picking up on with my clients is that this can look very different company by company by company. And I will say, though, that there's no question in my mind that virtual working to a much larger degree is going to be a structural part of the CX space. The question I've got is just how we're going to start seeing that level of balance play out. And I'm not even sure if 2022 is going to be enough time. I think we might be looking for a few years to see how this is actually going to emerge as an actual relevant working model.
Yeah, I think that a lot of companies underestimate how much cultural change is needed to make it work really well. And if you look at some of the BPOs that have been doing this for years, like 5CA and Sonsei in the UK, there's things that they do like, almost every meeting is recorded. So people who couldn't make it to the meeting can play it back. And there's all this sort of stuff that you don't normally think of this in a normal working environment. Mm-hmm. So I think that, you're right that, maybe even in another year, we won't really know where this is going to play out.
Yeah, and the reality too is, let's be frank, people don't like change. And it doesn't matter if you are an executive all the way down to the frontline worker. A change in mindset is very difficult and very challenging to deal with. However, we are seeing the necessity of change. It's being driven by exogenous circumstances in all aspects of the economy, CX being a very big one. And I think we should anticipate that whether it's a cultural issue, a compliance issue, that this change is going to be moving forward. And I truly believe that decision makers have to try and embrace it as best and as pragmatically as possible.
And it could even be a change in the way that the office is used. If you look at what Ascensos has been doing in Scotland, moving from one or two big contact centers to spreading small hubs all over the place so that they are much closer to people's home, which makes it much easier to do a couple of days at home and then 3 days in the center. So, there could be all kinds of different ways that this shakes out.
Yep, no question about it.
Okay, let's move on to another topic. Gig CX is something that we've been talking a lot about in the past year. And I think that what's really interesting is that when we entered into this year, companies like Live Exchange, it looked like they were trying to compete against the BPOs. They were saying, here's this new model, Gig CX, we can build a virtual contact center. And I think that what's kind of shaken out during this year is that most of these guys are actually trying to augment existing sort of CX structures. So if you have a captive center, or if you're working with a Sitel or Teleperformance, you can actually then augment what you've already got with a Gig CX platform. So I think that's certainly a big change. And, we did the McKinsey and Live Exchange New Age in Canada episode it was around the middle of this year, I think June or July. And I thought that was very enlightening, because you actually saw New Age saying, well, when we hit Black Friday, it normally takes us 40 or 50 minutes to answer the phone. And then when they added in a Gig CX layer on top, they got it down to like half a minute to answer the phone during the middle of the Black Friday craze. So, I think that clearly there's a growing acceptance that maybe Gig can offer flexibility when there's things like seasonality problems.
Well, exactly. Gig has been on the radar now for a couple of years, but I think it's really finding its footing. There's number one, I think a lot more conception about what gig is. At first, when it started out, it was a 40,000 foot view. It was an expression that you could apply to almost any industry. A gig working was a term that, quite frankly, didn't have good connotations within a lot of circles, regulations that were being passed around how gig working was going to play out in jurisdictions was being done to try and level the playing field. But in the CX context, I think that the providers that are embracing gig and that are providing gig solutions have really found a manner in which of understanding how this applies, how it works well for the clients, how it works well for the consumers that are being serviced by gig, and the fact that it doesn't need to be overly complex. It doesn't need to be overly cumbersome to implement. That's, to my mind, probably the good news story that we've seen in terms of this whole element of how gig is being incorporated into very sound CX strategies over the course of 2021. And I fully expect that in 2022, that's going to continue.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that there will be a lot more trust in this model in future as people start realizing that the gig is a platform that can augment, your already existing CX strategy. So we're not talking about replacing it with a bunch of Uber drivers or whatever, Okay, let's move on. I just want to mention one more topic then, and this is something that I think you and I have been talking to other people. In particular, Steve Loynd had some very interesting ideas around the idea that there is a certain level of ambient CX that's around us all the time at present, and that's kind of being driven by artificial intelligence, and it's really brands that are watching you. They're aware of what you prefer. They're aware of what you're browsing. They're aware of the type of products you might want to purchase and when you might want to purchase. And so this is not the kind of traditional, very reactive CX, a contact center just reacting when a customer gets in touch. We're seeing much more of a rise of sort of predictive analytics and predicting customer behavior. And I think that this also ties into another point that I've written about a lot in the last couple of years, which is the complexity of modern CX and how this stuff is getting really complex. I mean, you don't just need a group of contact center agents anymore. You need robotic process automation coders, AI experts, data miners, machine language experts. There's all kinds of different technology that you need to engage with the modern CX platform. So I think that, how would you pick up on what Steve was saying about how it's all around us all the time now then?
It is, and it shouldn't surprise anybody what you're watching on a streaming platform. It's not just about what you're watching, it's about analyzing and keeping that into a database. What you're purchasing on an e-commerce platform, any good one, will be able to record these transactions and try and use them to figure out how you're going to buy in the future. Mark, it even goes back to, I remember a few years ago when you and I were visiting London on a conference trip, and you were noticing that you were checking into all these different locations in terms of restaurants, in terms of bars, in terms of shops. All that information's analyzed, all that information's used. And I think from a CX standpoint, this can be really, really good. It can help organizations secure relationships by being able to pinpoint potential purchases of products or services that an individual might decide that they're going to incorporate into their life cycle as a consumer. Now, I think that the key here is that it's got to be done in an intelligent way. And as Steve said, I think the term ambient is brilliant. It's got to be done in a way that you're not going to see this interfering with your life. When it starts getting out of control, when you start finding that this is getting intrusive, and I think we've all had examples where perhaps we've been emailed or text messaged about an offering that is being done based on some previous purchases or an analysis. It all depends on the consumer. But from a CX standpoint, understanding what somebody has been purchasing, understanding what somebody's more likely to purchase, and putting those forward in such a way that's not going to be intrusive, that will be just as effective in terms of securing long-term revenue opportunities as providing a great interaction, be it digital or voice-based.
And you wrote about this recently, didn't you, when you did a comment on Spotify?
Yeah. Exactly. Spotify, I think, is a great example about this, and the way that they are able to take a look at each individual subscriber, what they've been listening to, the extent to which the subscriber has been playing more songs than others, and then, as they call it, Spotify Wrapped at the end of the year. Here's your present. Here's your holiday season present. We've wrapped up what the 100 songs are that you've been listening to, and people love it. I've seen more buzz this year about Spotify Wrapped than I've ever seen in the past, and it's amazing the brand loyalty they've developed. Now you've got people sharing on social media platforms. Here were my top 5 songs. Here are my top 10 songs. What were yours? It's just, the brand equity is just incredible. You can drive from something like that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I can imagine that we're going to be seeing Steve Loynd singing that old 80s classic CX is all around, as it featured on Love Actually.
Only if we're lucky.
Okay, so what were some of the points that you were thinking of talking about then?
To my mind, one of the things that really struck me as an important factor of 2021 in CX and going into 2022, I think it's going to maintain that level of crucialness, is agent empowerment. Now, in the past, Mark, as you know, the idea of agent empowerment probably meant to most people finding a way to allow agents to do their jobs better. That might mean increased training in terms of how to be a good CX agent, or it might mean installing certain programs that will allow them a better view of the customer. But I think that CX empowerment from the agent standpoint in 2021 took on a life of its own. The labor crisis that so many different economies are facing, I think, forced so many different CX operations, whether it was outsourced or whether it was captive, to think about what they need to do to find the great talent and to retain it. And one of the elements of retention I've been really heartened by, and I've seen a lot of different organizations in the CX space do this, is try and provide more realistic career paths for the agent community. You know, it used to be they would say, oh, well, look at this person used to be an agent. Now they're the CEO of the outsourcer, or they're running the contact centers for the captive. Now it's a case of figuring out what people want to achieve. It's being able to figure out an individual career path for agents so that they can move up perhaps from a frontline role to a quality assurance manager, or to an operations director, or to potentially something in IT. Maybe it's internal communications. Maybe it would be the CEO. But the reality is understanding that everybody's going to have different interests. Everybody's going to have a different career path. And being able to tailor that on a step-by-step basis is probably the most heartening thing I've seen. And quite frankly, probably more constructive in terms of reducing the attrition crisis we've been seeing happening over the course as long as I can remember in this industry, and making the idea present, omnipresent for agents, that this is not a stopgap job, that this is something you can really build and you can grow into.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that point. And I think that for too long we've seen that kind of stopgap job, summer job, temporary job. That's been the attitude towards the role of the contact center agent for so many years. And I think that when you look at the modern contact center environment and you see there are actually pathways into IT, marketing, sales, you get expertise in workforce management and go into human resources. So there's all kinds of different specialities, but then there's all the really technical angles, the coding, the automation, the artificial intelligence, the data analytics, so there's about 100 different career paths that you're now realistically looking at.
There are 100 different career paths, and it's good that there's a recognition now within the CX operations of many different organizations that they have to do this if they're going to stay pertinent. And I think about some of the discussions I've had recently with people who are at the highest levels of outsourcers. And I did a podcast, you might remember, a couple of months ago with Tijana Dimitrovic, who is the president and chief executive officer of Contact Service in Serbia. And she started as a part-time contact center agent. Now she's running the company. And she was the first one to recognize that if an organization is going to do this well in regards to hanging on to the best talent, they've got to be able to get down to as granular level as possible for each agent and try and figure out what they want to achieve and how they can empower that. That's such, I think, a fresh approach to what's going on in the industry today. And what Tijana was saying, I'm heartened to see is replicated by organizations around the world.
Yeah, and I think that really we're sort of saying, like, it's about time we stopped accepting that over 100% attrition is just normal. We replace the entire company every single year. And instead, maybe if we offered some career paths and things like flexibility. So, if you need to finish 2 hours early on Friday because you've got to get your kids from school or something, then we could actually be looking at people getting longer term careers and just more general day-to-day job satisfaction as well.
No, you're spot on. And this is something that I think we're moving towards. And Mark, you asked about other topics that I think are going to be very relevant. One issue that has come up the last probably 6-7 weeks that's really gotten onto my radar is this whole element about trust and safety. Now, One of the things that I've really picked up on is the fact that social media has emerged as the go-to digital platform when it comes to customer experience management. In fact, in the most recent omnibus survey that we did at Ryan Strategic Advisory, social media was the second most used CX channel after voice, which is tremendous because, only a few years ago it was seen as niche, but now supporting consumers across different social networks is just something that organizations accept. One of the things that the agents or the people responsible for moderation are not accepting is the extent to which that they're being subjected to online abuse, or that they're being subjected to interactions that might encompass elements that are perhaps very unpleasant, in some cases highly illegal. And there's a realization amongst the different organizations that are providing social media support that this is just not something that they are going to put up with and they're going to tolerate. And this is where I think the use of smart AI, it's an oxymoron, but smart AI, but the applied use of artificial intelligence to try and weed out some of these more unpleasant or illegal factors that an agent might be subjected to has really taken on a life of its own. And I think that's good. There's no question about the fact that digital communication has been a boon for the CX space, but with opportunities come challenges, come obstacles, and this is one of them. So to my mind, as we move into 2022, I think trust and safety when it comes to digital media management from the CX perspective is going to be so important and very top of mind for different organizations.
Yeah, I think that we've seen this in the social media area, particularly. This is where most people focus on it because we see so much, obscenity and abuse across the social media platforms and the trolling as well. But many individual brands themselves also encourage things like user-generated content. So things like reviews for products or being able to share photos and stuff. So it's not only the social platforms that need to control the content that's actually been uploaded by users. And I think that this opens up another interesting question, because most of the BPOs and the CX specialists that we talk to, they've all started working on content moderation. So this area of checking and guaranteeing that content is safe for a user community. And as you mentioned, the AI is now very smart. 99% of the time, the AI will say this is an unsafe post and it will never see the light of day. But that does mean that probably the 1% that has to be kicked off to a human to go and check is probably going to be extremely offensive. So I think that we also need to think carefully about how do we manage these kind of roles, because I don't think that that's a very good work from home environment to be sitting there looking at offensive content all day. You need to be in a fairly controlled environment with support, psychologists, nobody telling you when you can and can't take a break, all this kind. So it's quite a different environment, I think.
Very different. And I think everything that you just said is being factored into at least forward-thinking organization strategy in terms of how they manage these digital interactions. Because quite frankly, nobody should have to tolerate some of the instances that many people who are involved in content moderation supporting digital CX are being subjected to. And in my mind, this is something that we've been tracking for the last few years. Content moderation as a service for the outsourcing community in CX has definitely always been out there, but I think that we're going to see this take on a life of its own going into 2022.
Okay, I think that's probably time to wrap up. We've covered off at least half a dozen topics there that are going to be of interest to the community next year, I think. Well, this is right at the end of 21. Next week, there's going to be a CX Files featuring Leanne Rowlands and Stephen Lloyd talking about their view of the year ahead. But do you want to introduce some of our ideas for what's going to be happening from mid-January onwards then?
Well, I think that you and I are both quite excited to just give a little bit of a hint and a teaser that there will be some changes coming to the CX Files. We've had a great run in terms of the current format, but everything is always due for a refresh at some point. So the listeners, no matter where they might be in the world, can expect, I think, a new approach, an approach that will certainly be resonant and contemporary with 2022. And I would encourage everybody to just stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of fun ahead.
It should be a lot more interactive, and I'm really looking forward to that. Okay, so I think just to close out, Happy New Year, Peter.
And happy New Year to you, Mark. It's been a great 2021 and looking forward to an even better 2022.
And to you. And Happy New Year to all the listeners as well. So it's been great to run through the show this year, and let's hope it goes even better with the new format in 2022.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people, or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.